asked me just to do a quick intro for the people who are speaking today. And since we have one already, we're just going to begin. And then I'm going to ask Jeremy number one, who will forevermore be Jeremy number one, to sort of give us a little overview of the podcast that they do and the disability advocacy that they do as well. I wanted to ask you, Jeremy, first, I know you're a Rotarian, I know you're in Cape Town. The other Jeremy is in Indianapolis. How did you two meet?
Well, like all things, including most people in this room, through Ken. So all roads lead to Ken. So that's how we met.
That's good. And you decided once you had figured out that you had similar ambitions for advocacy and disability and DEI, that you would put together a podcast. How long have you been doing that? It's been literally a year or more. We haven't done many, sadly. We should actually be more prolific. So we haven't done many. We've only done 3 or 4. But once again, it was a Ken sort of initiative. Ken put it together, and it's the sort of background man while the two of us interview somebody of interest, and we engage in a dialogue. I'm a strong believer in dialoguing rather than interviewing, and so we engage in a 3-way dialogue, or perhaps sometimes 2-way dialogue if one of us isn't there, and it's just to really get people to come out of comfort zones and to really share in a safe place experiences. And I think what's very important about this business is that it's about asking the right questions. And because Jeremy and I are both, one, having disabilities, and two, are experienced, we can ask the right questions, and you can cut through a lot of fluff that way. So that's really the origin of the podcast, but we need to do more. Ken, pay attention. I did not take any of that interviewing and asking the right questions personally. I just want you to know. I'm always available for criticism and to get better at everything. And so you do a lot of speaking. How do you get those gigs?
Well, I do a lot of speaking. I discovered I could speak in public about 25 years ago. I'd never really done it before. And there's my name, brother. And so I discovered I could speak it about 25 years ago, and it became my business. I was doing training. I'm not a great fan of the speaking, as in speaking circuit or motivational speakers. I've never been enamored with that, and notwithstanding, there could be people in the room who do that. That's fine. It's just not my movie. I prefer to train, so I created a training program, and I tend to so they're much longer engagements, day, 2 days, half a day, that sort of thing. So when it came to Rotary, meeting Ken, by then I was an accomplished, comfortable speaker online, and I had no difficulty in communicating. So it's a natural, what's the word, vocation, or it's a natural thing. I had no difficility.
Mm-hmm. Did you say that you see Jeremy number 2 pop up here?
Yes,
he's here.
I saw him come in the room now. Yeah.
Yes. I just pinned him. Yep.
Good morning. I am sorry for being delayed. There was a death in my stepkid's family, and we had to getting them ready and out for a funeral. So
understood. Understood.
Do you need to extricate yourself and deal with it?
No. I'm good. It not in the part of the family that I am connected to in any way. So but yeah, it was more just getting them going, and so
understood.
I am now home, and they are off on their way to the funeral, and I am able to focus. So I do apologize for the delay.
No need. Good morning. I'm Ina, and I am the chair of this extraordinary group of people that get together twice a month. We have a steering committee meeting on one day, and then we have an open meeting the next. And we always want to have speakers who will help us learn about advocacy and how we can be better advocates for the situation that we find ourselves in, plus to be sure we leave a legacy for all of those getting polio around the world who will struggle with post-polio syndrome at some point in their lives, most likely. So that's the reason that we're having a meeting today. And Ken is the go-to. He's the guy who keeps all the plates spinning in the air, like on the old Ed Sullivan Show. And he never seems to drop one, which is magnificent for us. So I just had a chance to speak to Jeremy number 1, and he got that title first because he's older, second because he was here first.
Oh, he
And
deserves
now,
it.
and you, Jeremy number 2, would you tell us just a little bit about yourself before
Sure.
we have this dialogue?
So I am in the United States, Indianapolis, to be specific, and grew up here. And 17 years ago, I was managing a hotel on a college campus about an hour away from here. Spent about a decade in that industry, and then during a commute home one night, a 16-year-old turned left in front of me on a county road, and I wound up trapped in a burning Jeep Wrangler for about 20 minutes. Sustained 4th-degree burns to both legs. They had to be amputated above the knee. And that launched me into a experience as a person with an acquired disability that has completely changed my life and taught me how to use my voice in ways that I never ever thought I would even consider doing. So so I got out of the hotel industry, developed my own business, first as a public speaker, then as a consultant regarding outreach, and also now DEI consulting from specifically a disability lens. So.
Got it.
Yeah.
And so Jeremy number 1 said that you really sort of focus on dialogue, that you really want to talk to each other about when you're doing your podcast or when you're just doing your speaking. So I'm going to back out a little bit, and I'm going to let the 2 of you pretend that we are avid listeners to your podcast. And what would you talk about today?
Oh, that's a fascinating approach. You know, and I love that. The point being to talk about advocacy and understanding that embracing the concept of disability and why, with a quarter of the world's population being people who live with some form of disability, and that population is constantly growing simply as a matter of an aging population, why it is so important to be able to associate with those concepts and advocate both for our individual needs when it comes to our unique circumstances, but as an actual culture, as a people, with very diverse disabilities among it, but how we can support one another by using our voices to raise awareness of the issues, and not just awareness, but build allyship and making the changes that will make those issues less insurmountable.
And Jeremy, one, you just nodded. Where do you agree with that? And
well, thank you, Anna. I loved what he said there, particularly the allyship. I think that's very important in the advocacy sense, is allyship. So, I mean, my profession, I'm a diversity practitioner, but obviously I tend to, not obviously, but I happen to spend most of my energy on the sort of, I call it the invisible D of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if you look at the DEI acronym and you look into the way they work, there's no question that the majority of the energy is around race and gender, LGBT. Whereas, and although disability is clearly meant to be in the frame, it invariably slips off. All the books and the narratives that we read pay lip service to the disability issue, but very rarely deal with it appropriately. I've just finished an excellent book on DEI. If anyone is interested in the subject, it's called Unconscious Bias, or rather it's called A Leader's Guide to Unconscious Bias. And it's from the famous organization, Franklin Covey. And it's an outstanding book, except that it absolutely doesn't do justice to the disability aspect of unconscious bias. Notwithstanding the mention of disability here and there, it just doesn't get the nuance. It doesn't get micro, macro, any kind of contextual reality. It doesn't understand disability from a holistic point of view, as opposed to fixating on an employment issue. And so I've spent, as I said, 24 years. That's when I decided to start my own business and do this for a living. I did another job entirely. I had no interest in disability issues before that, and I was blind then. Maybe some people in the room aren't aware, but I should have mentioned this in the beginning. I know most of you know, because I've met most of you, but I am blind, and I've been legally blind all my life, and I am now essentially totally blind. In other words, I had low vision before. And so I did a job as a marketer and a salesperson in the human resource business. And it was only in 1999 that I decided to look into the disability issue, simply because I saw a business opportunity, a niche. And so I followed that niche, which is disability integration preparation, to help organizations understand disability as an entity, not just as a potential employee, but as a member of society, including customers and consumers. And this is where, for instance, that wonderful book that I've just read forgot, or rather overlooked, the fact that people with disabilities are consumers as well. And this, to my mind, is a crucial element which is often missing. And in my country, it's hugely missing, because we're not supported by overarching legislation like you have in the United States and in Europe, etc. We don't have such a piece of legislation, sadly. So my energy has been largely focused on making organizations and entities disability confident, so that they engage when they need to, they can engage with them without hassle.
Gotcha. Any responses to that, anybody? That was really quite enlightening. Jeremy, too, what would you respond to him?
Well, I think, that's what Jeremy's getting at, what I mentioned there in regards to how much of the population lives with a disability. It really is, it's a strange thing that globally our societies have developed with this concept of any disability, and by disability I don't just mean physical or sensory, but all the different complex disabilities that are out there, that those are aspects of everyday life that everybody is living with. And yet somehow our societies globally have developed with this concept that those are things to be fixed, and that they are medical issues and illnesses and conditions, without recognizing that they are aspects of life to be accommodated in our society. And so trying to move to a social model where we recognize that it's a real big challenge to get folks to start using that language appropriately, to start working with each other to do those things. And that's, I think, where Jeremy has gone with his business. It's kind of what I've been trying to do with mine, is that building this social structure that welcomes everybody, and so you have a greater sense of belonging, which just leads to greater emotional and mental health.
So Jeremy, number 2, what gives you hope right now?
What gives me hope? the fact that a guy who is blind in South Africa and a guy who has no legs in Indiana can build a friendship in this world through advocating for these kinds of things. It's that kind of stuff that's happening every day all around us that we never see in the media. That is going on. That's what brings me hope, is recognizing that life is actually far more positive, and that when you focus on what's around you and the people that you can impact, I find that it is far more accommodating than we think it is. Sorry, I have a dog that is going nuts. I'm going to need to get him inside. If you guys, can you hear
Yeah,
him?
it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's not too bad though, Jeremy. It's not too
No,
bad.
it's not bad.
No.
It's not bad. So,
Okay.
Jeremy Opperman, so he's given us reason to be a little more hopeful here. What are the roadblocks? What are the walls that you hit still?
Oh, it's a great question. So I'd like to go back a little here. I think it's what is really important is to understand, and I know we've said it a lot, and everyone knows about medical model versus social model and then nuances, but I don't think people always appreciate the significance of medical versus social model discussion. And what's important about it is that they're not binaries in the sense of one against the other, because it's a paradigm shifter to move from one paradigm, such as the old way we looked at disability, the welfare / biological / medical model. And the 50 odd years ago, when the penny started dropping, that barriers in fact were significant, that paradigm of the old paradigm hasn't finished yet, because people, like all of us in this room, are adults, and many of us are older adults. And we, in turn, were taught by adults who were very much steeped in that old mindset. And so far too many older people, and middle-aged to older people, are completely steeped in the old-fashioned thinking. It's very difficult to slough that off, to lose that mantle. So you can't just slip into the new social model paradigm all about barriers easily, especially with older people. And so the greatest challenge to me is to, well, there's two things. One is I also see hope, because we all see change. I think every one of us appreciate that there is some recognizable, demonstrable change. Slow, sometimes very good change, but still slow. But the other thing is that we're on this journey for a while yet. That recognition of the fact of social model thinking will only land with my children's generation, really, where they can appreciate disability from a different perspective, which our generation simply didn't, because we simply weren't. And notwithstanding all the great work done by Judy Heumann, etc., that's an outlier. That kind of work is outlier stuff. So what we want to get to is where it's no longer an outlier. So, so that's really the point here, is that we must appreciate that we're on for a longer journey. And we've got a couple of years yet before social model thinking lands, really.
Oh, I find that really fascinating and hopeful, and I never looked at it quite that way, but you are so right. And we see it with the people who join in with us. And we talk about how each one of us has to advocate for ourselves first, in order to educate the people around us, whether it's a nurse practitioner or a doctor or a family member, who tries to encourage us to, why don't you just walk in the mall for a few hours,
Yeah.
So that's a very broad subject, and I appreciated that you brought that up. Anything else that you need to chat with him?
Yes, I'd like to expand a little bit, actually, because,
please.
And you touched on it now, and you hinted at something which is really important, is that our generation and older, who were the first, when polio really hit the world with a punch, 90, 80, 70 years ago. You know, there was a completely different perspective on disability, and also the way that you yourself were supposed to behave. So as a blind person, I grew up believing that it was a good idea to pass. So passing is where we pretend we see more than we do. It's a classic it's a blindism. We tend to pretend, like me. I'm making eye contact to many of you now because I know exactly where to look at the camera, even though I can't even see the laptop in front of me, right? So that's a passing thing. Now, from a polio point of view and a physical disability point of view, many people were told, don't complain. And their families very often hid them. And so there was a shame factor. And so there was this, unfortunately, too many people didn't stick their necks out like Judy Heumann. And so we had this, you know, and that's where you got this whole idea of, well, you know, don't stare at them, don't engage with them because, you know, it's embarrassing for them. And so there's this whole poor me, poor them thing going on. And that's as a result of the way we were brought up in our peculiar way that we were taught about disabilities. And that's what's changing. And that's what's exciting now, is that there is a greater emphasis and a greater appreciation of engagement. One of the most important words in disability advocacy is engagement, because our generation didn't engage much with disability. And the younger generation do. After a little funny story the other day, I was with a friend of mine, happens to be a wheelchair user, and we were at a school talking about making the school more accessible. And a youngster ran down the corridor and he screeched to a halt next to my friend who happened to be in a wheelchair, looked at him in the wheelchair and said, "Wheelchairs are cool," and then ran off. And I loved that. I loved that. It was just, it was so brilliant.
Yeah, that's a new one. You know, you use the word pass. I don't know if I've ever spoken to a polio who didn't say that there was a point in their lives when they could pass for normal. And pass for normal was the expression. And when we did all get a little bit better and we could camouflage some of the things. And then we go back to a completely new kind of disability. The hiding and the shame, you know, as young people, I remember very clearly sitting with adults as a child because I couldn't play with the other kids, and hearing that having a disability was a fate worse than death. And I could not imagine that they were talking about me. I mean, it just didn't make sense to me. And so I tended, you know, I didn't buy it. I didn't buy the package at that time because it just didn't make sense to me. But every one of us has that same kind of experience, I think. And so I appreciate hearing that. Now, engagement, go back to that. John, number 2, can you talk about that? Jeremy, back to that a little bit.
Well, and that's the engagement. I mean, it really, changing perceptions means being willing to be vulnerable about the things that frustrate you, the challenges that you deal with every day. That concept that Jeremy was talking about, I certainly run into on a regular basis every time I go into a grocery store. And if I walk in with my prosthetics and my crutches, I have seen children run from one end of the store to the other because they want to see the cyborg that just walked in the door. And I have seen their parents grab them by the hands and say, "No, don't look at him." Or when I hear the child say, "Where are his legs?" I hear the mom say, "Don't ask that question." And so there's this reinforcement from a generation of parents that says you can't ask those questions, that's not appropriate, or you can't look at that person, don't see them. There was a time when there were laws here in the United States that people with disabilities were not to be out in public. You know, the last of those laws actually was in Chicago, and I want to say went away in the mid to late 70s. You know, it's shocking to believe that went on. So what I do when I am in that situation, I frequently will follow the family and say to the parents, I noticed that your child had some questions. I wanted to give them an opportunity to get the answers from me and to be able to ask their questions and have a good positive experience with this. And the parent will just look totally shocked and scared, and then the child will pop off with a question that is, you know,
Reasonable.
reasonable and free of filter.
Right.
Smart
And
very
smart,
often
yeah.
too.
Yes.
And smart.
And yeah, and so, you know, but I've also though seen other people with different disabilities refuse to answer those questions and react in a negative way. And so even that among our own culture, our own population, we run into the same unfortunate reinforcement of a negative impression. So it really does take everybody being willing to be vulnerable and talk and open about what their experiences are and how they can accommodate those challenges to reach the same goals that someone who doesn't have those challenges can reach.
Mm-hmm. You know, you mentioned that I don't know about that in Chicago in terms of rule, which I certainly will follow up on, but I was in Moscow a long time ago, and I noticed that I was the only person that I saw for days with a cane. And I had lunch with the CNN bureau chief there, and I just said, Jill, I don't understand where all of the disabled people are. And she said, before perestroika, we didn't allow any disabled people, whether they were intellectually or physically disabled, to live in Moscow. And so if you go 20 kilometers outside the city, you will find villages that are filled with people with disabilities because they didn't want that to be part of the landscape in Moscow.
That it's an absurd illusion that they are building that ignores the reality of life.
And they did.
Disability is a reality of life.
And I was treated very badly by the police. You know, we wanted to cross a street and he refused. I was with 4 other people and he refused to let us cross the intersection. He kept pointing to the stairway. I had to walk down 3 flights of stairs, do an underground walkway across this big intersection, and then walk up another 3 flights of stairs. I know. It was a nightmare. It was a nightmare.
That is nonsense.
So
I know.
on that note, I know if I can chip in here, there's another way of looking at this as well, is that in my country, so an interesting thing happened some years ago, 25 years ago. My brother-in-law came out from Holland and he noticed very quickly that he couldn't see too many people with disabilities in a big pedestrian area called the waterfront here. And he was blown away by the fact that he didn't see too many people with disabilities. He saw me with my cane, and he asked me why. And I educated him about our reality. But the fact is that I hadn't traveled overseas yet. So when I did get to travel overseas, and I took my family to Holland, my family were blown away. Not my wife so much because she had seen it before, but my children. The first thing they saw in the trains, in the buses, and then my boy kept saying, and he was 18 already, and gee, hey dad, check that, there's a guy in a wheelchair. Hey dad, check that, there's a guy in a wheelchair. Hey dad, check that, there's a guy with a guide dog. And it became a thing that we would walk around and the kids would tell me how many people with disabilities they saw, simply because in Cape Town they never did. And I mean, they knew people I knew, but that wasn't the same thing. That was artificial because it was in my home. But and so there is that element. I mean, Jeremy is absolutely right about that law. It had a quite a quaint name, but I can't come to it in Chicago.
I can't remember it either.
But there's an extension. Sorry, Jeremy. There was an extension to that. I remember 20 years ago there was a big fallout of an advertising executive, and I'm talking about a real executive. In other words, the head of an advertising company. Got into terrible trouble from his client, who happened to be a large footwear company, for wanting to use persons with disabilities as models in an advertisement for footwear. And he got into trouble because he said, "Don't you know that our ads are shown at supper time and we don't want to put people off their food?"
Okay. I have nothing to say to that.
I saw that.
Jeremy, too, can you remember what that law was and what it really said? Any of it? I'm gonna dig it out because I think it's worth putting in the paper here.
Oh yeah, I mean, I will have to look up what that type of law was called.
What was it meant to do? It was meant to.
People with disabilities had to stay in the home unless they were being transported to medical, appointments or facilities. People with disabilities were not allowed to be seen in society. I can't remember specifically and it was not just in Chicago. Chicago was the last of those laws to be repealed, but they were across the country. I just can't remember what those laws were called.
Well, maybe we should offer a prize. Maybe we should offer a prize to the person on the call who can find more information, because it's interesting that somebody in this country have heard of it as well.
Yes.
Somebody just wrote something. Let me just see here. In a chat. The Chicago Ordinance of 1881, any person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object, or an improper person to be allowed in or on the streets, highways, thoroughfares, or public places in the city, shall not therein or thereon expose himself or herself to public view under the penalty of a fine of $1 for each offense.
Well, there we go.
And that was back in 1881. So
1881.
So $1 in 1881 was something.
That was something. Oh my God. It's a Wikipedia. Somebody found that. Who found that? Whoever did. Thank you. Oh, Carla, thank you. Oh my God. Okay. I don't know what to say.
I didn't remember the disgusting part, I must say.
Yeah, really. I'm thrilled with it. There we go. Oh, okay. I'm stuck. I'm stuck right now. Somebody talk.
Well, and so, I mean, that's the thing, though, when you think about the history of people with disabilities, and you don't even get down into what those specific disabilities are, you realize that we have been a part of society for as long as time has been measured. And yet we are still having to advocate. And when, like for me, losing my legs in a traumatic fire, you would think, I mean, I was employed, I had great insurance through my employer, and yet with every single prosthetic leg that I was ever prescribed, I had to call the insurance company after I received the initial denial to say, I need prosthetic legs to be able to walk. That is a medically necessary piece of medical device that I need. And every single time, well, for the first several legs, when I would call, the response would be, "Oh, we're sorry, Mr. Warriner, somebody made a mistake." And each leg is its own claim, and yet they were making that mistake with every single claim related to a leg that I had. Then when I was prescribed a set of legs that could dramatically improve my stability and my confidence and reduce my falls and reduce my injuries, and also reduce the wear and tear on my musculoskeletal system, that was denied 3 different times with 3 different explanations, and ultimately beaten because they were using terms like experimental in ways that did not match the actual definitions of those terms.
Wow.
That was how I finally got, but I mean, that literally took 3 years of fighting with the insurance company to get that covered. And the only way that was possible was by, one, not giving up with each denial, to actually talking to other people and other professionals out there about the challenge that I was having, to get their suggestions and their recommendations. And again, that's the allyship part of it, is by recognizing that you can't do this alone. You have to be able to get the support and the expertise where it is. But at the end of the day, you also can't rely on others to do it for you. You've got to raise your voice.
Did you ever have an advocate who understood the workings of the health insurance companies?
What I did from that angle was that I worked very hard to develop a, well, first to get a point of contact within my insurance company who I could go to regularly and develop a relationship with that person within, I mean, not an inappropriate relationship, but to develop a relationship with that individual to be able to get that support, working through that on the inside. And then on the outside, I spoke absolutely with legal professionals, other people with disabilities who had fought the insurance company on claims like that.
Got it. We're going to have a speaker soon. I met the other day a woman who does how to be a healthcare advocate for yourself and loved ones. And she's written a real how-to, a really good guidebook, and she covers a lot of these issues in there. She's going to be an upcoming speaker for us. So I'm just giving a little heads up for people. She's really quite good.
That's wonderful.
I know we're down to about 12 minutes left. John had to leave. He had a pipe that was leaking, so he had to take care of it. John Nanny. So
as long as it wasn't his personal pipe, I'm all right with that.
Jim has his hand up. He has a question. So I mean, John was very good at doing questions, and I'm going to be horrible at it because of my ADHD.
All right.
But
you got it. Yeah, you got it, Ken. I just want to mention here in Kansas City, we have a very great group called Variety KC that works with initially with children, but even adults with disabilities. And I can tell you that this weekend, we announced the first time ever in the world a soccer field designed for accessibility, be used in wheelchair. And 3 weeks ago, the first airport in the world to have both for all ages accessible a play and waiting area for accessibility. But the keynote of that group, Variety KC, which Rotary helped develop, was the concept, in spite of being disabled, and this has to do with engagement, you need to convey the message that people that are disabled are not necessarily disabled. They're people with different abilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We understand the language is always different in different places, but that's exactly right.
Yeah, but proud of what we're doing here in Kansas City for disability. And it's even been underwritten. Some of you have heard of Mahomes, who is the quarterback for the Kansas City Chiefs. He basically underwrote the cost of that soccer field. So
nice. It's a good thing to do with his millions. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and John, thank you, Jim. John McFallon.
Thank you, Jim.
John McFallon has his hand up.
Thank you very much, Ken. Jeremy's, both of you, how do you feel about taking DEI into schools? And just as another comment for you, I know what you're talking about, Jeremy, in South Africa. I looked a bit like a freak, or felt like one sometimes when I was going down the Blue Shed, down in the waterfront area and going from there. I know what you mean about coming to this over to here. And I've got a slight argument with Kansas for the simple reason that Birmingham International Airport, not Birmingham, Alabama, Birmingham International Airport in the UK, was actually built with total accessibility right from the start, because the CEO was an ex-BA pilot who broke his back, and he had it all when he was appointed made so there is not one area which is not accessible. But I'm talking about DEI into schools. I go into schools and I get asked questions. I'm quite prepared to answer any of them. and I get asked questions in the street in Ireland and in Europe about disability, I'm more than happy to go in, and my foundation goes in and talks to school children from the ages of 6, 7 years right the way up to leavers.
So yeah, I'd like to respond to that, if I might. So it's a hugely important thing is to really get DEI. I know there's a couple of stories there. The one is, when it works, it's bleedingly obvious what a good idea it is when the schools embrace DEI, particularly from a disability point of view. The obvious thing would be you would get more kids with disabilities in that school, and everybody benefits from that. Now, one of the problems with that is that leadership is very often either great at it and they do it well, or they're appalling, in which case they don't embrace the idea and it don't happen. Now, the other problem with that is that teachers very often, teachers are sometimes stuck in that old paradigm and they've blinkered themselves to the opportunities. And so they run a mile sometimes from the idea of embracing. And I went to a mainstream school as a legally blind boy, so I know quite a lot about what it's like. And there were some teachers who couldn't have done more for me if they tried. And there were I had one teacher who kept asking me in the beginning of every year, "Are your eyes better now?" Passionately hoping that she wouldn't have to work quite as hard to accommodate me. And so it's vitally important. But what's important is to really get somehow to put into the curriculums of the teacher training programs how important inclusion is, because many teachers are still stuck in an old paradigm that said you need to separate kids with disabilities from able-bodied kids. Well, now I'm glad to see that in many parts of the world that's changing and changed. And that's great to see inclusion, but still to this day, there are problems with inclusion, and that's largely due to the short-sighted, old-fashioned mindset that we so often see in officials of all stripes.
Understood.
Yeah, if I could throw in there, so my sister is a kindergarten teacher in a Montessori school, and she has me come in every year to speak with the kids in her class and in all the kindergarten classes and the first grade classes. And what's been fascinating is that when I am there at that school, I do not see the kind of discrimination that I saw when I was a child in the same public school system. And I think that is largely because of how far we have come, at least in the United States, in the schools, and there's still so far to go. But that is, they make it a point to start off by having me come in and talk with the kids in kindergarten about what it's like to live life with a disability, and what, why concepts of diversity and inclusion and compassion are so very, very important. And when I come back into those classrooms to the school, there will be sixth graders who see me and they'll come to the door of their classroom to see me walk down the hall because they remember me being there in kindergarten. It really does have a huge impact on society. That's why it's so important to start with those concepts at such young ages.
Can I chip in there, because there's something missing there, and I mean, notwithstanding anything you've said, Jeremy, but what's missing is that we're not seeing enough teachers with disabilities. If we were to see more teachers with disabilities, and that's often where the problem lies, is where many, certainly in my country, there's no question that hundreds upon hundreds of teachers have been medically boarded, which means they go on what's called disability, they're pensioned off because of eyesight diminishing or a physical accent or whatever. And they're discouraged from teaching categorically. And that would make a difference if we could, because that's normal world. So coming in and talking, that's why I don't particularly like talking heads or motivational talking, because yes, it's great and you can be very good at it, but it's it's limiting, especially from a
Mhm.
school point of view. We need to see more normality with teachers with disabilities.
Mhm.
There were,
I know. Can I just
go
put a point to Jeremy on this one? I
Yeah.
totally agree with that about the teachers with disabilities.
Mhm.
And I actually put my success down in life to the fact that my headmaster at the fee-paying school where I attended from the ages of 13 onwards until I went to university was in fact a polio survivor himself.
Mm,
And he
brilliant.
just made everything, and he looked at everything, went through, and he actually advocate. Now, this is I'm talking back in the 60s, 1961. Very unusual at that stage to get people to actually embrace it and go right the way through. And he turned that whole school around. And it is, in fact, one of the best schools now. And it has a very high proportion. 20, I was down there the other day. It's in England. 28% of their teachers all have some form of disability, whether it's they've got Down syndrome people there actually teaching woodwork right the way through to people with visual disabilities and everything else. So it is a roaring success.
Wow. That's very
Bravo.
encouraging, isn't it?
there was one comment in the
Yeah.
chat that I want to just make note of, and Carla put that chat comment in there. And that is that as advocates, we're really teachers. We're teachers of teaching people about disabilities and inclusion and things like that. And I know Jeremy W. We just did a video, he and I together. There is a case before the Supreme Court regarding hotels. And there is a woman who is what they call a tester, who actually was suing hotels for not having accessibility on their
Website.
Yeah, and we can share that video from Jeremy if anybody wants.
Yeah, I'd like to see that, please.
Right. Well,
one of the points that Jeremy made. Hold on.
yeah.
I'm sorry. One of the points that Jeremy made, that we have to be teachers. We have to teach the hotels about accessibility.
Well, yeah, and not just the hotels. We have to teach really the entire public sector, wherever we are, whatever we're doing. And what I was going to say in regards to that case, what's really at stake there is not necessarily whether or not people can sue hotels, but whether or not people with disabilities have the ability to pursue those kinds of cases, those ADA complaints, when they become aware of those violations or those non-compliant organizations, without necessarily having been a customer of that organization.
Right.
And that's what's at stake there right now, because there are no ADA police. We have the ability to file a lawsuit against a hotel because they don't have online reservations for accessible rooms available, whether or not we were intending to stay in that hotel.
So it's just about, a friend of mine just got served papers, but no one ever called her and said, are you accessible? And she would have to say, this is a very old mansion, but when we know we have a customer coming, we have a ramp system, that we can put out for you and make sure that you're comfortable, but they don't put that on the website, and she just got served papers.
And that, yeah, I mean, if there are ways for them to be accessible and they don't have that included on the website, then yeah, they're in violation, because then a person with a disability doesn't know that they can access the property. They're not being transparent in regards to how accessible they are, and if they're not, what isn't accessible and why. So yeah, I mean, and there's so many details that go into that. Like, did they do anything, make any kind of structural changes in the last 30 years that would require them to have become fully compliant? That I don't know the answer to that, but yeah, there's all sorts of things there that.
So it's
that
really
come
just
into
about
play.
the website, isn't that seems so wrong, though.
Well,
if I was going to go someplace, I would call
sure.
if I don't see it, but that just seems wrong to me.
Well, the point being that, and this was something that was done in the 2010 updates to the Americans with Disabilities Act. Anything that any person with no disability can go online and make a reservation for, if that facility is accessible, people with disabilities have to be able to make reservations the same way.
I see.
And so
Okay,
it's
I
not
got
just
you.
hotels, it's
I got you.
concerts, it's ballparks, it's
I got you.
everything. Yeah.
So the
So-
bottom line is that we are teachers, and
Yes.
with those of us who have PPS and the medical profession is not recognizing it, we need to be the teachers. Unfortunately, we need to be the ones getting that medical profession as advocates to recognize it.
Yeah, there was just a question asked in the chat of, is there any enforcement? And that's the question that's at stake in front of the Supreme Court right now, is that the enforcement was always recognized as being people with disabilities with the ability to file complaints under the Americans with Disabilities Act with the Justice Department. And what the Supreme Court is currently looking at, depending on how they decide, could restrict our ability to do that.
Well, and here's a question for you, Jeremy, as being a former manager of a hotel. If I have a disability, I go there and your hotel is not accessible, and I speak up and tell you that, what's your response?
Well, if the hotel isn't accessible, one would assume that I would know why it's not accessible. and if it's not accessible because it was built before 1990 and no structural updates had been made, then that, unfortunately, it's just the physical nature of the facility that it's not accessible. My recommendation to any hospitality organization or any organization that serves the public sector, if your services are not acceptable or accessible, you need to have recommendations for people with disabilities of where they can find similar services in your market that are accessible to them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Any other hands up that you see, Ken?
No, I don't see any others, but
Everybody? Then I'm just going to speak and say we learned a lot today. We appreciate so much the time that you share with us to teach us all about our own personal advocacy as well as the world around us. And any one of us would be happy to be on your podcast, any one of us.
Well, we would be happy to have you guys, and thank you so much for opening yourselves up to us joining you today.
Yeah, we are.
Yes, and by the way, Anna, you have the greatest questions, so don't worry. You definitely asked the right questions.
Thank you.
I think she has another career as a
Yeah,
news,
here's what I know for sure. If I walk into a room or a Zoom and I'm the smartest one in the room, I'm in the wrong room. And so I can't tell you how much it means to me to sit here and to absorb and take notes and learn something new today. So thank you all.
And I think John Nami put some information about your birthday bash coming up.
The birthday bash, 2 weeks from yesterday.
Can I throw in one final thing before folks leave? In regards to the Americans with Disabilities Act, the last title of that, Title V, is that if you are a person who doesn't have a disability, but you are advocating for someone who does, and you feel like you're being discriminated against, you are covered as well. So that is something that is important to know. And it's also important to know that whether or not you have a medical diagnosis, if somebody perceives you as having a disability and they discriminate against you because of that, you're also protected from that discrimination by the Americans with Disabilities Act.
I know. We must make the point as well that what's been talked about is ADA. I go back and I was actually in on Capitol Hill when ADA was passed and being negotiated way back. There are things which are different in different countries. That the situation in Europe is different. The situation in the UK is different to even some of the situations in Europe. situations in various countries alter, and that there are enforcement police which go around. They're called planning officers and strategic officers in the UK. I know Reg is actually sort of grinning up there, but it doesn't always work under Schedule M. But there are laws, they do change, and they're in different areas. And if you actually, we've got to, one of the things as advocates that we've got to do is we've got to actually advocate across the spectrum. We've got to actually open the spectrum up wider, so that we take in Cape Town, for example. We take in the fact that the hospital where my sister-in-law has just been admitted in Joburg with a severe stroke is not accessible to her daughter who's in a wheelchair. You know, and you've got those sorts of things, and also the experiences which are going up in Zimbabwe and various other countries, and what's going on in India, which is where the biggest advocating problems lie, in sub-Saharan Africa and the Indian subcontinent, for old polios. And we've got to look at the whole thing of disability, and disability covering the total spectrum. The thing that Jeremy in South Africa has no sight doesn't make a damn bit of difference, because stuff which is done for a mother with a wheelchair, so there isn't a step in a way, is helpful to him as well, because he doesn't trip over it. It goes right the way across. And it is not just one disability, it is all areas of disability. I'd love to have a conversation with the two Jeremys at some stage.
Okay.
Jim has been asking about the podcast link. Jim, the part where we had the podcast, the host of the podcast site leave it up for a long period of time. So we are actually in the process of moving it to another site, and we will certainly share that once we get that all set up. Just so you know. Maureen has her hand up.
Excellent presentation today. So my question is, one of them was just answered, but the other question is, are you all going to do once a month on the second Thursday, keeping your meetings once a month from now on?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for asking that. All right, are we all ready to face the day and the evening, Mr. John McFarlane?
Oh, it's just getting into the working mode at the moment.
Oh. I'm on my way to breakfast lunch. Okay.
And it's just about sundown time in Cape Town.
Oh yeah.
Just about.
I'm reaching for a beer as we speak.
Oh, excellent. Thank you all for a glorious morning. Thank you. We'll see you in 1 month.